In a world constantly talking about renewable energy, Ontario recently reaffirmed its commitment to nuclear. Since December, multi-billion-dollar plans have been announced for the Bruce, Darlington, and Pickering nuclear stations. It's a big bet and one that not everyone agrees will pay off for Ontarians. Joining us now for his view, Jack Gibbons. He's chair of the Ontario Clean Air Alliance. And Jack, welcome back for the first time in 10 years to TVO.
Thank you, Steve.
It's been a long time. Let's put information that you surely know up on the screen for our viewers to see as well. Here's how, when you turn the lights on in Ontario, it works. That big patch of red on the right there, 61% of our power supply is created by nuclear power. You then go to the bottom left, you've got hydroelectric at 22%, gas at 12%, wind at 4%, and biofuels and solar slightly less than 1%. That's essentially how we do it. What you won't see on that list anywhere is coal, because of course we phased out coal-fired generation in 2014. Let me ask off the top, 18 nuclear reactors in the province providing 61% of our power. You okay with that?
No, we don't think it makes sense to rebuild 10 of our aging nuclear reactors as Premier Wynne is proposing, because we think there are better alternatives, cleaner, safer, lower cost.
Okay, nuclear is pretty clean, would you agree?
Well,
in as much as there's nothing that goes up a stack.
Well, it's true it doesn't produce the smog-causing emissions that the dirty coal-fired power plants produced, but it does produce a highly toxic radioactive waste that lasts for hundreds of thousands of years, and we still don't have a long-term solution to how to store them safely. The nuclear power, it's a very high-cost option. It's a very high-cost financial option, and it's pushing our electricity rates up and up and up.
High cost in what respect? The cost per kilowatt hour of nuclear power is, I'm told, very cheap.
Back in 1999, the old Ontario Hydro was effectively bankrupt. It was broken, it was split into a number of companies. Ontario Power Generation got the nuclear assets, but $20 billion of the nuclear debt was shifted to another company called the Ontario Electricity Financial Corporation. So that makes nuclear power on Ontario Power Generation's books look cheaper than it really is, because they're not paying the full capital cost of those aging nuclear reactors.
Okay, how about Bruce Power? Bruce Power said when it goes and does its renovation job on the nuclear reactors it's got, it will handle it will be responsible for all the cost overruns. Should that not be of some assurance to citizens in Ontario?
Well, according to Bruce Power, according to the Government of Ontario, according to their preliminary estimates, the Bruce rebuild will cost $13 billion. But that's just the preliminary estimate. If you look at the actual wording of the contract, the price that you and I will pay will be based on the final cost estimate. And so if the final cost estimate is greater than $13 billion, then that cost overrun is going to be passed on to you and me.
And what do you anticipate the cost per kilowatt hour will be at the end of the day?
Well, every nuclear project in Ontario's history has gone massively over budget, on average by 2.5 times. So if history repeats itself, the Bruce Power project could cost up to 14 cents per kilowatt hour or more.
Except that as long as Duncan Hawthorne has been running Bruce as a private company, all of its retrofitting and renovations have come in, from what I'm told, on time and on budget.
That's absolutely not true. They have not come in on time, and they have not come in on budget. The last two reactors that Bruce Power restarted, went $2 billion over budget.
So are you saying that the Bruce Power people are simply lying to me?
If they told you they brought their projects in on budget, that was not true. The last two reactors that they restarted were $2 billion over budget.
Okay. Jack, they're going to spend, I guess if you take all the nuclear projects together, it's $26 billion to renovate and fix up, modernize these nuclear reactors. That's $26 billion that will, admittedly, it's a hell of a lot of money, but it stays in the province of Ontario. It employs people in the province of Ontario. There's a lot of jobs there. How is that not good for the province's economy?
Well, let's look at the Darlington rebuild project. Ontario Power Generation says it will cost $13 billion. But as I said, every nuclear project has gone over budget, on average by 2.5 times. So Darlington will cost us somewhere between $13 and $32 billion. And that's going to be paid for by taxpayers. And if we spend $13 to $32 billion on the Darlington rebuild, that's going to drain the infrastructure budget. It's going to drain the provincial infrastructure budget. So we'll have less money to spend on transit, on roads and bridges, on hospitals, on schools. So we believe a much better way to spend our infrastructure dollars is on transit, on roads, on schools, and hospitals, and that will create many more jobs than the Darlington Rebuild project.
Okay, let's take a look at, here are, Sheldon, we'll bring this chart up here. Ontario's largest cities compared to other cities across the country in terms of what we pay residential electricity prices per average. And this is, again, per kilowatt hour. And you start at the top of the list. You can see it on the monitor there. You start at Halifax at just over 16 cents a kilowatt hour. Charlottetown, there's the first Ontario city. Ottawa at 14. Toronto, a little over 14 as well, and all the way down to Winnipeg and Montreal, which are much less expensive than us. Our cities are not the highest price, but we're not the lowest either. Is that about reasonable where we are on the list right now?
That's an accurate description of the prices, yes.
Is that an acceptable amount, do you think, for paying for power?
Well, I think what's important to notice is what are the two cities with the lowest rates?
Winnipeg and Montreal.
Winnipeg and Montreal. And Manitoba and Quebec both have virtually 100% water power systems. So that reflects the fact that really the best option to meet our electricity needs is water power. And instead of rebuilding our aging nuclear reactors, Premier Wynne should have negotiated a deal with Quebec to import low-cost water power from Quebec.
She didn't. And I want to take a look at something you wrote a year and a half ago about what you thought about her not deciding to do that. Here's what you wrote in the Toronto Star. As an alternative, letting the oldest reactors die and replacing their output with clean, renewable water power from Quebec could save Ontario $600 million a year in foregone nuclear costs, beginning as soon as the two neighbors decide to end the electricity separatism that has traditionally stood in the way of such a logical and mutually beneficial hookup. Now, Jack, you can't use an expression like electricity separatism without raising a few eyebrows. So what is that?
Well, Ontario has had a policy of electricity separatism for over 100 years.
What does that mean?
It means that we refuse to buy power from our neighbors in Quebec or Manitoba. We've refused to sign long-term contracts to avoid the need to build power plants in Ontario.
How come?
Well, originally, 100 years ago, electricity separatism made sense. At the beginning of the last century, Ontario had huge untapped water power resources, like at Niagara Falls. And it made sense to meet our electricity needs by developing our low-cost water power resources. And if you can believe it, during the first half of the last century, as we developed more and more made-in-Ontario water power, our electricity rates and bills fell every year. But by 1960, we tapped out all of our low-cost water power. And therefore, electricity separatism no longer makes sense for Ontario, because now our lowest cost source of new supply would be importing water power from Quebec.
Does Quebec sell its electricity, hydroelectric power, anywhere else besides to the people of Quebec?
They export it. They've had long-term export contracts with the city of Cornwall for decades, provided Cornwall with a very reliable supply of power for decades. They've also have long-term electricity supply contracts with Vermont, and they make spot sales, short-term sales to the other New England states and New York.
And it's always been reliable?
Always been very reliable.
And low cost?
And very low cost.
And clean, obviously.
Yes.
Okay. You say we would save $600 million a year if we got our electricity from Quebec. Where'd you get that number?
Well, we compared the Ontario Power Generation's estimate of the cost of rebuilding Darlington to the price of Quebec's electricity exports to the United States. And according to the Quebec Energy Commission, most of Quebec's electricity exports are sold to the United States at an average price of 3 cents a kilowatt hour, which is a lot lower than the cost of rebuilding Darlington. So what we suggested is a price in between. We would pay Quebec more than they're getting from the Americans, but less than the cost of the Darlington rebuild, so we could do a deal that was mutually beneficial for both provinces. Hydro-Quebec would get higher revenues, higher profits, and we would get lower electricity bills than if we proceeded with the Darlington rebuild.
Presumably, though, if you want to get the power from Quebec to Ontario in a fashion that now does not exist, you'd have to build new transmission lines to get that power here. How much would that cost?
Well, there already are interconnections with Quebec, so we can, at the moment, we can import enough power from Quebec to replace approximately 75% of Darlington's annual output. But we do need to, if we want to fully replace Darlington with power from Quebec, we do need to make some improvements to the Hydro One transmission system so we can take more power from Quebec. So we need to make some more investments. We say the cost is about $500 million of that investment so that we could displace 100% of Darlington's output by importing power from Quebec. Now, the Ontario's electricity system operator has come forward with a higher cost estimate of $2 billion, but that involves also building a brand new intertie near Cornwall. And if we made that $2 billion investment, not only could we displace all of Darlington's output with water power from Quebec, but we could also displace half of the output of the Pickering nuclear station.
All right, here's the thing I don't get, and I read your stuff pretty religiously. You send out emails all the time, and,
right.
and I'm on your list, so I read your stuff. And you have made this case for many, many years now that we ought to be doing deals with our neighbors as opposed to reinvesting in our nuclear capability and the baseline power that provides. If this argument that you're putting forward is so obviously logical on the face of it, why have we never had any government of any stripe? I'm not just talking about this government, but the previous Conservative or previous NDP governments either. No one's jumped at this, Jack. How come?
To me, the decision to proceed with the Darlington rebuild project looks like a gold-plated make-work project.
Is there something to be said for we ought to be, if I can steal the Quebec phrase, mettre chez nous, and that is make our own power within our own borders and have control over that source of power?
No, I don't think so.
Why not?
Because water power from Quebec is much lower cost, it's cleaner, and it's more reliable.
We don't control it, though.
Sure we do.
Well, no, we don't. It's in Quebec.
We buy lots of things from the rest of the world. We have free trade agreements with the United States and Mexico. We buy products from Japan. We buy products from Europe. If we can have free trade with other jurisdictions, why can't we have free trade with Quebec that's part of the same country?
Oh, fair enough. But this is, I mean, some people are making the argument that this is almost a national security issue, that you need to be in control of the levers of creating your own electricity, and you don't want to be at the beck and call of anybody else, because if, heaven forbid, it became scarce, obviously Quebec would take care of its own people first, ahead of people in Ontario or Vermont or upstate New York or wherever else. I mean, that's logical, isn't it?
No, it's not.
Why not?
Because we will be signing a long-term supply contract, and there is no doubt that Hydro-Quebec would honor that contract. And Steve, let's put this in a bit of perspective. You know, Ontario gets not virtually all of its natural gas from Alberta and Pennsylvania to heat our homes, to power our factories. No one ever objects to the fact that we get 99% of our natural gas from Western Canada and Pennsylvania. If we can get virtually all of our natural gas, which is a fossil fuel, from outside of the province, why is it wrong to import 20% of our electricity from our next door neighbor, which is the fourth largest water power producer in the world, and has the lowest electricity rates in North America?
I'm assuming the reason is because if we do that and let our nuclear capabilities disintegrate, you've said goodbye to a pretty high-tech part of our economy. Is that part of it?
Well, yes. We don't think nuclear power makes sense for Ontario. When we originally decided to invest in nuclear power, we were promised that it would be a very low-cost source of electricity. Back in the 1950s, they said nuclear would be too cheap to meter. But the nuclear industry hasn't delivered. Nuclear power is now the highest cost option to keep our lights on. We have much lower cost options. In addition to water power imports from Quebec, energy efficiency is much lower cost. Wind power is now lower cost. Many people think that within a few years, solar energy will be lower cost. So the nuclear power, it was a 1950s solution to meet our electricity needs. It is not the smart 21st century solution to keep the lights on in Ontario.
But it's more than 60% of our power makeup right now, that pie chart we showed off the top.
Right.
Can you replace that entire 60% of nuclear power in the province of Ontario with something else?
Yes, we can. And we're not advocating a premature phase out of nuclear, but most of our nuclear reactors will come to the end of their lives during the next 10 years. And we're saying, don't rebuild them. But when they come to the end of their lives, shut them down and move on to cleaner and lower cost sources of power.
Just in our last minute here, the other argument I've heard is that wind, solar are clean and wonderful in terms of their being green, but you can't rely on them. And therefore, until we figure out how to store them, we still are going to need the good old-fashioned nuclear power to provide what they call base load power, stuff that's there whether the sun is out or whether the wind is blowing. Is that not true?
Yes, we do need a storage technique for wind and solar. That's right, Steve. But what people forget is that Ontario is located right next door to the best battery in the world. It's Hydro-Quebec's massive water power reservoirs. They are the best battery in the world. And so by integrating our electricity grid with that of Quebec's, we can turn wind from an intermittent source of power to a 24/7 reliable source of baseload power.
So if this is so obvious, why aren't we doing it?
Well, old ideas often persist beyond their valid time period.
Jack, we thank you for coming into TVO tonight and sharing your views with us.
Thank you, Steve.
Jack Gibbons, chair of the Ontario Clean Air Alliance.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit supporttvo.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.